You may have had occasion to reflect on how often the issue of masculine-feminine relations creeps in and influences us, even when such an issue is apparently quite irrelevant to the task in hand. I think, for instance, of occasions when we might perhaps have nominated someone for a committee on the basis of gender, simply because it feels better to us that the committee have a balance of the sexes. Or alternatively, we may try to keep out such a balance, as instanced by Margaret Thatcher and her all-male cabinet. I noticed this very same involuntary intrusion of the masculine-feminine issue occurring in connection with this paper. When today's convener, Mary Wilson, had asked me to submit a brief biography for the programme, I found myself forgetting and delaying. With some difficulty, I eventually pulled myself together for the task, and then realized that I had been anxious in case it would look unbalanced beside Dr. Zinkins, whose I imagined would be so much more important looking. The strength of unthinkable feelings that had been governing my behaviour made me recognize the work of the animus. This is a simple enough example. I'm sure you will yourselves find such day-to-day evidence of male-female themes trying to take over, which have no connection with the issue itself. I propose today to look at the archetypal root of the activity that insists we bring man and woman into relationship with each other, at that linking force which I shall call the matchmaking function. My sights focus not just on the actual uniting of man and woman in partnership, but on those opposite modes of psychological functioning which might be called masculine and feminine. That is, I think today about the anima, animus, as two dynamic psychic principles. I will illuminate some of its various facets by means of two fictional stories before presenting two case examples. You may have noticed that I referred to the archetype in the singular. It's been murmured more and more loudly that we should picture the anima animus as one archetype which has become divided, rather than as two separate entities, as one root that has two stems. In any case, the notion of two halves that seek each other out to make one whole is central to Jung's idea of the syzygy, the name he gives to the dynamic pairing of opposites, to that pairing force linking male and female, anima and animus. I think of both halves belonging to each individual, whether man or woman, and actively engaging with each other at all stages of his or her life. The aim of the matchmaker is to bring the potential of our inferior unconscious functioning into relation with that which is more consciously established. If we focus on the intrapsychic dynamic, we could say that it is through contradictory forces coming together and affecting each other that we resolve conflicts. The successful uniting of these opposites promotes internal growth and change. Where this dynamic process fails, life becomes lopsided or unrewarding. We can appreciate the need for the matchmaker function to be as powerful as it is, because often enough the push and pull of opposite psychic forces is too painful to bear, and consciously or unconsciously we avoid any attempt at one touching or affecting the other. However, if we are to enjoy a rich range of human experience, the pairing instinct needs to persist even against our conscious will until some sort of meeting between the two can be found. The dynamic I have been describing is shown in much greater detail in the alchemical pictures in Jung's work on the psychology of the transference, his collected works, volume 15. Here, the images of male and female uniting and separating to give birth to new levels of awareness are employed as symbols of transformation and growth. That is, such images depict different stages of individuation. My meaning will come through more clearly, I hope, through actual illustrations. My first story is one about the anima. The protagonist is a highly respected schoolmaster in early middle age. He presides over a boarding school of adolescent boys. Rules are strict, hard work and honour are highly prized. One might say they are too highly prized, as achievement, discipline and orderliness are fostered at the expense of certain feelings, which are considered dangerous and better to remain unknown. In fact, the discipline has been thus earnestly constructed with the very purpose of crowding out the possibility of pupils being allowed to experiment or come to terms with their feelings, especially those for the opposite sex, and by this means come to be in touch with their own anima possibilities, with those qualities such as tenderness and imagination that give colour and meaning to relationships. The schoolmaster himself appears to have reached this stage in life without having fallen in love. The lack of warmth from this deficit makes him an unlikable character, but one with whom we can sympathize when he encounters his anima with a vengeance. You will probably already have recognized my story as coming from the old movie, The Blue Angel, starring Marlene Dietrich. You may recall that a troupe of young female cabaret dancers comes to the district. They are regarded as of dubious reputation, and their premises are strictly out of bounds to the pupils. The master visits these premises to catch and punish two of his miscreants. However, underneath the high moral virtues that the schoolmaster thinks he so wholeheartedly stands for, the unconscious matchmaker is at work. He is bowled over by one particular dancer who knows exactly how to maneuver herself into the depths of his soul. The dancer, Marlene Dietrich, for her part sadistically enjoys leading him on and watches this highly prestigious man become a progressively more ridiculous figure, inept, gauche, and tormented. To further add to his disintegration, his pupils winkle out his predicament, cruelly mocking him, so that his authority as a teacher is also destroyed. In analyzing this matter, we could use the following theoretical construction. The schoolmaster projects onto the cabaret artist his own unconscious anima, which is urging expression. The potential energy belonging to the anima suddenly and compellingly bypasses all attempts at repression, regardless of the consequences. We do not feel that the story is false to human nature, because we all know how overwhelming such forces can be. If the schoolmaster were to be rescued from being a mere plaything of the anima, a victim of his passion, he would need to find a feminine figure good enough to respond to him in such a way as to help contain those forces. The processes of projection and introjection that take place with such a good enough mother or partner changes some of the anima's numinous energy into finite individual form. But the alluring figure of the dancer certainly did not serve this function, and had him at her mercy. The animus works somewhat differently. It is perhaps more abstract, not as clearly personified as the anima. To illustrate its nature, I shall refer to Jane Austen's novel, Emma, which you might know. Emma literally becomes a matchmaker. She decides that Mr. Elton and Miss Harriet would make a good match. Instead of trusting her observations, which suggest otherwise, that Mr. Elton is in fact setting his sights on her, Emma, she is driven by a conviction of being right into promoting the partnership. Despite the fact that the plan misfires, that Harriet is humiliated and Emma filled with shame at her mistake, she does not easily learn. With the same conviction of rightness, she busies herself in other matchmaking activities, again ignoring the signals that she may be wrong. Again, she is wrong, and she suffers. As the novel unfolds, Jane Austen delicately highlights the process by which Emma becomes a wiser, more mature woman. We are witnesses to the change. We see her developing an ego strong enough to contain the contradiction between her own fantasies and the external situation, so that both are taken into account. This is very different from the earlier situation, in which her blinkered wishes overrode her ability to make accurate perceptions. As a result of what we might call the integration of the animus, Emma develops both judgment and sensitivity and becomes able to reflect at a deeper level. For this new level of consciousness to emerge, however, Emma has had to learn both to see and to accept things as they are, even when they are counter to her wishes. For her to accept the circumstances, she has had to face a restriction on her omnipotent fantasies. From being in the grip of her own willfulness, she manages to come to terms with the archetype so that it works for her rather than against her. She then faces the reality of her love for Mr. Knightley. There is something more we can learn from these stories. We, as readers, have suspected the true nature of Emma's feelings for Mr. Knightley all along, before Emma herself knew it. The eros that inspires this is feminine in its psychological origins and part of the anima archetype. So it's not just the animus, but the feminine side of Emma too, that has a largely unconscious component. Equally, the story of the schoolmaster demonstrates the idea of unconscious animus activity inside the man. Thanks to Jung's descriptions of the animus-possessed woman, we are quickly able to recognize Emma's dogmatic and bossy ways as belonging to this archetype. However, if we think about it, we can also recognize that the bullying control of the schoolmaster over his pupils and the ruthlessness with which he treats himself are also very largely compulsive and unconsciously determined. He, too, is driven by the animus. So both stories conveniently illustrate the notion that both sides of the syzygy feature in each sex. There's not a simple, clear-cut gender correspondence. The anima is an unconscious figure only in the male, and the animus only in the female. This exact biological correlation is too restricting. In fact, in today's climate, it's quite common for a woman to relate to the world through a predominantly masculine persona, and it's not uncommon for a man to express himself through a predominantly warm feminine manner. Think, for instance, of some teachers, of male nurses, or of some fathers. Altogether, the masculine-feminine question is now seen as increasingly complex and flexible. It is well known that a girl first encounters her masculine awareness through projection onto her father. This means that her animus becomes integrated through the experiences she has with her father. What is just as important, and not so obvious, is that a girl also encounters her animus through her mother. The son, too, will relate to his father's unconscious anima. Thus, the child's unique personality will arise from both parents. There is an interplay between all four. The notion of the anima and animus both being potentially available through both parents helps us to comprehend better the wide spectrum of personality styles, and especially those of the ambitious, assertive woman or the maternal man. You will no doubt agree that it has been most liberating in our time for both men and women to be able to individuate towards the sexual balance that suits them best, without being restricted by the narrower cultural expectations which existed 40 years ago. That's all for side one. I shall now turn to clinical practice and give an example of how I picture the animus. The following is necessarily a much simplified overview. My patient, whom I shall call Deirdre, was a very immature woman in her early 30s when she came to see me. She looked much younger, with her long fair hair, large eyes, and a childlike appeal. From the start, she was forthcoming with her feelings. She seemed intuitive, was interested in her dreams, of which there were in abundance, and appeared to be comfortable as a mother. These and other impressions showed that she was reasonably at ease with her feminine persona. However, another side of her personality seemed seriously impaired. She was angry and discontented, and seemed unable to find interests outside the home. She was unable to organize herself, with the result that her daily chores were always on top of her, and she often had difficulty arriving at the sessions on time. The imbalance between the two sides of herself, on the one hand, not being able to think things through and structure her life. On the other, having a well-developed feeling side, was an important cause of her unhappiness. It left her emotions and fantasies undirected, and they ruled her. I understood the request for treatment as a reflection of her unconscious need to create a better balance between her masculine and feminine qualities. Deirdre described her mother as being very passive, someone who just accommodated to life without exerting any will of her own. She felt that her mother would be content to see her daughter hurt, rather than take her part, if it were to mean a conflict with other family members. As for her father, he was a remote figure who had not compensated for the deficits of his wife. So she had, as a child, just floated along in a dream world. These were important childhood factors contributing to the difficulty of developing such personal qualities as clarity of thought, observation, order, and boundary keeping. I think of the animus as being a blueprint out of which these kind of qualities might grow. Although Deirdre was asking for therapy, she was dismissive of the idea of any changes being possible in herself. She blamed her dreary life on her husband and on the ties of children. She fiercely warded off the uncertainty she felt about her own effectiveness by dismissing my attempts to look at this area. Having then closed off her own possibilities in this direction, she was extremely envious of her husband's success and resented the amount of time he spent without her while involved in his profession and other non-family pursuits. The conviction with which she asserted he was a total bastard and the evil she ascribed to him could not fit onto any human shoulders. We could perhaps say that he was an animus object to her. It seemed she assented to his doing the thinking for both of them, but then violently objected. Nor could she forgive him for making some purely selfish decisions. In particular, he had moved the family to London from the country and was disregarding her hatred of the place. She found this the biggest problem of all. She accused him of turning her into a kind of zombie. Did he care? No. Well, she had seen the truth, and in retaliation had found ways to put the boot in, make him suffer. In spite of her desperation, she showed considerable triumph in being able to exercise her power in this way. In our sessions, she became steadily more angry with me. She was convinced that I must be on her husband's side, as I refused to condemn him. Meanwhile, as the transference developed further, she began to attack me in an omnipotent bullying tone, as though I too was giving her insufficient recognition, was myself making her into a zombie, and did not care. She either ignored my interpretations or in other ways attacked the links I made. She exerted her power by putting the boot in, as with her husband. Her most destructive action was not to attend sessions when it was inconvenient to her. Because her husband was paying for the therapy, her vengeance was then doubly satisfying. We arrived at a situation where it was more gratifying for her to destroy than to construct, at what I call a negative therapeutic regression. I needed to reassess the situation thoroughly if it were to have a chance to succeed. It hadn't been enough for me to make conscious the connection between myself and the passive, ineffective mother and remote father on whom she was unconsciously wreaking revenge. What was required of me was to provide a very firm holding that could be felt as a positive experience and not suffocating or retaliatory. In order to do this successfully, I had to hold true to my own thoughts with authority in the face of her attacks, as well as to be sensitive to her fear of my power causing her fragile sense of personal boundaries to collapse altogether. Nevertheless, if she genuinely wanted the therapy to succeed, the archetypal, omnipotent world in which she was living would have to give way to a vulnerable, possibly painful, but real relationship with me. Getting her to think about limits was at this stage a necessary step in transforming the archetype into individual effectiveness. Consequently, I told her I wasn't prepared to go on working with her unless the conditions of therapy were fulfilled. These were that she come on time, did not miss sessions, and that within an agreed number of months she herself would be earning the major part of the fees for the sessions. A point I want to stress in this is that before I could get the matter in hand, I had needed to do some analysis on myself in which I took cognition of the notion of the animus mine and hers. I had also to decide that I could accept the failed therapy were she to choose to refuse the terms and break off treatment. When I spoke to her in the way described, she began at first to conjure up a rule which said that if she could not comply, I as a therapist was not allowed to simply dump her, a patient. However, my silence convinced her that she had to make the decision one way or the other. There was a long, thoughtful pause, during which I could sense her being taken aback, but then recovering and thinking in a new way. In fact, my firm holding of her was being felt as a positive enough experience for her to be able to look at and accept the reality of her situation. To refer again to our theme, we could say that the matchmaking tendency of the syzygy to bring the opposite sides of herself into balance then prevailed over the destructive regression. This episode records only one of many steps in a difficult therapy. Difficult because my masculine functioning was attacked so mercilessly, my thinking and my boundary keeping in particular. I'm happy to say I survived the impact, and that she gradually managed for the first time ever to set some objectives for herself, and also to tolerate her perceptions when they did not accord with her own internal schema. My second case is an example of how I think about the anima. For this, I look at the idea of an anima in a woman patient. This again is a very condensed outline, but nevertheless it indicates some of the processes by which the patient's anima is altered in form to become part of herself. This patient was a single woman in her 50s when she first came to see me. In her case, vital components of her feminine potential had remained as shadow, while masculine qualities were quite well integrated. I consider the lost femininity as anima because it was numinous and took possession of her very much against her conscious will. She was an intelligent, tall, somewhat angular person whose capacity to give order to complex thoughts was most impressive. Through her mathematical brilliance, she had followed a successful career in a male-dominated profession. Our joint aim was to help her relate to her missing femininity. Like the schoolmaster, this patient had, late in life, fallen deeply in love for the first time. Like his, her choice too was bizarre, and her relationship with the man quickly became untenable. Nevertheless, the experience had changed her whole life and had made her aware of what she had been missing. After the affair had ended, most painfully, she became seriously depressed and gave up her career. However, she had discovered important new feelings through this man, and in contrast, her previous life seemed now both dry and desolate. She could neither bear to return to her previous state, nor did she feel she had it in her to marry or learn to relate to anyone else with the same warm intimacy she had briefly experienced. However, she had just sufficient hope of recovering this new vision of herself to want treatment and be prepared to work hard to bring this about. The sessions at that time were long and empty. She did not dream, nor was she good at expressing feelings or recounting fantasies. During the long silences, I would try to imagine what was happening and find a language for her emptiness, or for any indication of movement in her feelings. I had a particularly strong sense of her needing to bond with me. With every small move forward, I found myself more and more sympathetic and concerned for her. In countertransference terms, my feelings perhaps mirrored new eros feelings that were beginning to stir in her. I felt that her need to bond with me was a kind of rudimentary anima projection. These feelings were still unconscious, however, and were fused with a perception of me as a highly critical figure. Her efforts, meanwhile, were all going into trying to be good and to win my approval. The effort to be good was repressively holding back a deep fear of me as a cold and critical mother, whom she greatly resented. One day, not being at my best, I was rather sharp with her. I knew my words had hurt her, and felt guilty and worried about them. This incident, however, led to opening up her tightly packed feelings. When she later told me with difficulty how awful it had been, I both admitted my sharpness and found that I could then pinpoint her fear of anything other than perfection. I confessed how restraining I had found our relationship in view of the impossibly high standards she was expecting from me as well as from herself. She felt the humanity in my response, and in return she then told me of her fear of exposing her excessive dependence on me, which she could only envisage as being messy and objectionable to me. She then linked this meaningfully with her mother, encapsulated by the words, "Don't fuss," whenever she was upset or needy. This was the beginning of her acknowledging a shadow side of herself as existing and finding human expression in our relationship. It was only then that the anima could be differentiated from messy neediness. Her outrage about this being denied could emerge, and then her erotic and loving feelings could come through. I chose to present the anima in this woman patient because I find that the fusion of the shadow and the anima commonly occurs with women, just as it does with men. To review some of the points contained in this paper, the schoolmaster story showed the interpersonal role of the anima, the schoolmaster's idealized fantasy projected onto the figure of the cabaret artist. Emma denied her budding sexuality by projecting romantic ideas onto others and busying herself in their affairs. To take them on board herself without going to pieces, she needed a strong containing ego, which we see gradually developing. My two clinical accounts emphasized the intrapsychic dynamic. Both Deirdre and Ruth needed to experience the missing part of themselves. The cases of Deirdre and Ruth are interesting to compare because on the face of things so different. Deirdre's animus is unavailable to her except in its primitive form, whereas Ruth's was a very definite part of her personal identity. It was her feminine side that had been drowned out. So I suppose it could be said that one task of the therapy with both of them was to promote some internal matchmaking. By coming to terms with limitations of time and place, Deirdre became a more effective individual. Ruth was rescued from her isolation and went on to form warmer relationships. I have primarily looked at both these patients from the point of view of what they were trying to accomplish for a more fulfilling personal life. In looking for what the patient is struggling towards, the notion of the anima-animus archetype is most helpful. However, for the therapist to hold this prospective view in mind doesn't preclude him from dealing also with a patient's personal circumstances and early traumas. Unfortunately, I haven't today had the space to weave these into my account. In general, a change has slowly been evolving in our understanding over the years. Instead of aligning the anima and animus strictly with sexual gender, we recognize the individual as having the unconscious potential of both available to him. When the two successfully unite, new levels of personal awareness are forged. If our understanding of the archetype is that it is no longer exclusively tied to gender, some of you might think that might reduce its value as a concept. Well, it certainly raises a number of questions, and I hope we may go some way towards asking and answering these in the discussions today. That's the end of side 2.